The Jews were not the first people to tell the stories that we have in Genesis in the Old Testament. Those stories were handed down to the Jews through Abraham. Abraham was born in the city of Ur, which is an ancient Sumerian city. And when the Sumerian cuneiforms were dug up in the late 1800s and especially in the early 1900s, there on these clay tablets were the original telling of the Old Testament stories 1,000 or more years before Abraham. So the stories that are told in the Old Testament are condensed, shortened, incomplete versions of the original story. If we go to the original telling of the story by the Sumerians, we find much more detail, and it explains so much more. One of the things that it explains is the nature of the genetic warfare that has determined the history of humanity since that time. And in order to understand this, we have to realize that the first chapter of Genesis and the second chapter of Genesis are telling two very different stories. There's a creation story in chapter 1 that most Christian pastors never refer to. They always refer to the creation story in chapter 2. In chapter 1, according to the Sumerians, who wrote down these stories before anyone else, chapter 1, it says, the Creator God, and he goes through the 7 days, made us, said, let there be light, created the dry land, all the animals, and it says, and made man, male and female, in the image of God, and said, be fruitful and multiply. So there's the creation of humanity, both men and women at the same time, both men and women in the image of God, told to go procreate, go forth and multiply. And the word the Sumerians used for God in the chapter 1 is the Creator God. In chapter 2, which in the King James Version, instead of saying God like they did in chapter 1, they say Lord God in chapter 2. In the original telling of the story, what was translated as Lord God was the Sumerian words for the ruler gods, or those who came down from the sky. So what the Sumerian texts are telling us in chapter 2 is that we were visited by extraterrestrials. They came down from the heavens, which is how the ancient world referred to the stars. They called them the heavens. And in this chapter 2 of Genesis, according to the Sumerians, the way they describe it, there was already humanity on Earth. But these extraterrestrials landed on Earth and created a genetic hybrid by mixing some of their DNA with the DNA of humanity, and created a hybrid human that included some of this extraterrestrial DNA. And these extraterrestrials were reptilian. So you have the serpent in the garden. And in that story, remember that at one point, the person who the Bible refers to as God, but we can tell from the Sumerian records that this was like the leader of the extraterrestrials. He said to the serpent, or this other reptilian, because you have done this, I will put enmity between your seed and the seed of the woman. In other words, the children who inherited the reptilian DNA, the hybrid humans, would have enmity toward the feminine and toward the children of the natural human beings. So you see, when you have different genes available, some are dominant and some are recessive. So in other words, the reptilian traits that were grafted onto humanity's DNA don't necessarily show up strongly in every one of the children. In some of the children, it may not show up at all. So you have basically someone who is still an original human being or an indigenous human being. In other children, the hybrid DNA might come out strongly. And so carrying on, we have to ask, what does this word enmity mean? Well, enmity is hatred. And the difference between love and hate is that love is unity. Love is identifying with. Love is including in your community. If I love someone, they are part of me. I am with them. Hatred is separating and cutting off. I want nothing to do with them. They are different from me. Love is a unifying factor. Hatred is a cutting off, a separating factor. So to hate or to have enmity towards the woman is to cut them off and think of them as inferior and evil. So when we see that in the early doctrines and writings of the Christian leaders, when we see them calling women evil and in league with the devil, and saying they're weak or weak-minded and should not speak in public or should not be in leadership roles, that's all thinking of the woman as other and separate and less than, inferior. And there's any evidence that we have of misogyny, that's hatred of women. And that's the patriarchy. But what I'm saying is, here is where it began. The patriarchy began with the hybrid, the extraterrestrial genetic hybrids, enmity toward the natural human being. And when the original hybrid was created, according to the Sumerians, these extraterrestrials went through a lot of trials, trial pregnancies, trying to give birth to a successful mix of their genes with the indigenous human genes. And after many trials, they finally were able to get a viable specimen, which was Adam. Now, after going through all of that, they didn't want to have to go through all of that to try to create a woman for him to mate with. And so they scraped his rib and created a clone. It's only in modern times that we've discovered cloning and discovered that the best way to make a clone is by scraping the rib cells from the being that you're cloning. But there it was in the ancient texts of the Sumerians that that's what they did. And that's why in chapter 2 of the King James Version of the Bible, in the condensed version of the story we have, that it says Eve was made from the rib of Adam. So you see what I'm saying about how the Sumerians had much greater detail in the original telling of the story than what we have now. So the next step then was for these extraterrestrials to wait until they could find this perfect specimen that had stabilized within the offspring of the original genetic hybrid that they made, the Adam. And so you have this keeping of the genealogy of Adam, basically all the way through ancient history in the Old Testament. They're keeping a record of the genes. Because remember, I said this is a genetic war. Now, when we come to Abraham, this is where the extraterrestrials found the stable specimen that had the qualities that they wanted to produce in humanity. And they tested him. They told him to take his son up on the mountain and murder him. And Abraham was willing to do it. The test was Abraham was willing to follow, be obedient to an external authority to murder his own son and override the internal moral compass that original humanity comes with, which is where the voice of God, which comes from within, that tells us right from wrong. And this genetic hybrid, Adam, was able to override that and be obedient to an external voice that's telling him to murder his own son. He was going to be obedient and do that. And that is the quality that the extraterrestrials wanted to implant in the original human population of Earth. The lack of compassion, the willingness to follow an external authority through the influence of the mind, what is being told to do, rather than follow the intuition that comes from the heart and the feelings about feeling what's right and what's wrong. So they wanted a hybrid human being who would override that, which is basically cutting yourself off from the spiritual guidance of God that comes to us through our feminine side. We all have a masculine side and a feminine side in our consciousness, the two polarities that allow energy to flow that is necessary for human life. And it's a self-correcting guidance system when both sides are honored. But when you split it and create a being where they feel like the intellect has to dominate and even override the objections of the feminine side, the intuition, in order to do what it is convinced it has to do, that's when humanity falls into a spiral of devolution rather than a spiritual evolution. And so they found this stable specimen in Abraham, the one who was willing to obey their orders even to the point of overriding his own humanity and his own connection to humanity, his own connection to his own son. He's going to override that feeling because he's convinced it's the right thing to do. That's the domination of the feminine by the masculine, rather than a partnership where they get to see eye to eye and understand each other's viewpoint and find the real truth. That's wisdom arises from the balance between the masculine and feminine. Life depends on the dynamic equilibrium between opposing polarities. If you have just one program, you have nothing to check yourself if your thinking falls into error. But when you have abstract thought and organic, concrete feeling working together, these two modes of processing information, it's a self-correcting guidance system. The only way an outside influence can take control is by cutting the mind off from the heart, cutting the intellect off from the intuition, convincing it that it should override and ignore and deny the value of the feelings and the intuition, to say, I am completely right, and if the feminine objects, I don't care because the feminine side has no value. That's patriarchy. That's the root of it in consciousness. And that's what was planted into these hybrid, genetically altered human beings. And when Abraham passed that test, what did they say to him? They said, we're going to multiply your seed so that it's like the sands on the seashore, or like the stars in the sky. So he's saying there, he's going to, the extraterrestrials told Abraham they're going to basically have his seed take over the earth. And they said, and we will teach your seed, your children, how to control the governments of their enemies. And that's what we see happening in the world today. So they created these extraterrestrials created the hybrid, genetically altered human beings to be the type of beings that they wanted to multiply. And said in in this chapter 2 of Genesis, this extraterrestrial that is being called God in the Bible says to the reptilian, there's going to be enmity between your seed and her seed, between the hybrid seed and the original humanity seed. And once they found the stable specimen, they outlined the war, the genetic war. We want the hybrid of humanity that we created that incorporates our genes. We want you to spread across the planet and take over the governments of your enemies, referring to all natural human beings as enemies. Ultimately, with the ultimate goal of this genetic warfare of first enslaving and then finally eradicating the seed of natural humanity, so that all that's left on Earth is the seed of the hybrid that was created by these extraterrestrials that is going to follow or the orders of the extraterrestrials and do inhuman things, not only to ourselves, but possibly as being drafted into the extraterrestrials' army and doing inhumane things to other species on other planets. So Jesus, when he came along, he called them out. He said, remember, Jesus forgave everyone of every kind of sin except the leaders of organized religion. Every time they came around, he called them whited sepulchres, whited tombs. In other words, whitewashed on the outside, but full of death and filth on the inside. He called them hypocrites. He called them deceivers. He said these leaders of organized religion put heavy burdens on the people, but didn't carry the burdens themselves. And most of all, he called them liars and sons of the father of lies. Now, the father of lies in those days, that's the euphemism that they used to refer to Satan, or the adversary, the reptilian being that had damaged humanity and had enmity towards humanity. So he was saying that these leaders of organized religion were the descendants of the genetically altered hybrid that the extraterrestrials created. These leaders of organized religion in the Jewish community. He identified them as sons of Satan. And he told this parable. He said the kingdom of heaven was like, a farmer's field where the farmer had planted good seed. And in the night, a thief had come and planted bad seed. And when this was discovered, when the crops started to show themselves, and this farmer's servants came to him and said, what do you want us to do? Should we pull out the weeds that are coming from the bad seed? And the farmer says, no, that might damage the good seed. We have to let them all grow up together. And they will, they'll show, they'll blossom, they'll show who they are. And it's at the harvest time that will separate the good seed from the bad seed. Now, I've never been able to find any other explanation for what that parable means, except this one that makes perfect sense once we got this information about the original story from the Sumerians. Now it makes perfect sense. Jesus is talking about planting, that God planted good seed, or that the farmer planted good seed, and then a thief came and planted bad seed. And in the story of creating the genetic hybrid, the story of Adam and Eve, we've got this being that the Sumerians, said were extraterrestrials, but in our Bible it says God. Of course, the Sumerians thought of them as gods, but that word got translated by our translators because of what they already believed into God. So, but the explanation for the parable Jesus told, he's talking about the planting of seed and then the thief planting the seed. Well, the seed was talked about back in that story when the leader of the extraterrestrials said there's going to be enmity between the seeds that had just been planted by the extraterrestrials, the genetic hybrid. That's the thief coming in the night planting the bad seed. And he's saying that there's going to be enmity between the seed of the genetic hybrid and the seed of the original human beings, the indigenous people. So you see, they're talking about the same thing. That now makes perfect sense because chapter 1 of the Bible talks about the Creator God creating humanity. That's the farmer planting the good seed in the field. And then it's in chapter 2 when the extraterrestrials come down and create a hybrid human, genetically altered human. That's the thief coming in the night planting the bad seed. If that's not what Jesus was talking about, you tell me what. Nothing else has ever made any sense. This makes perfect sense when you see the connection, when you understand what's being said rather than what we've been told that it says by people who, for the most part, don't understand it and actually believe what they're saying. I think, although I've encountered at least one church where I met this woman who had been an accountant for the church and quit her job when she heard them. She stayed overtime to do some extra work, and they didn't realize she was there in the other room. And she heard them talking about what fools the congregation were and how all they had to do to take a vacation in the Bahamas is tell their congregation that they want to do a spiritual outreach to the people of the Bahamas. Everybody gives them extra money on Sunday, and they take their vacation to the Bahamas, calling the congregation fools and just laughing at them. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of honest pastors who actually honestly believe they're doing the Lord's work, even though they're in the synagogue of Satan. But I know from personal experience of this one church, because I also went to the church and I saw what was going on, that it's quite possible that they do know that they're lying and misleading people. So Jesus called them out, and if you find it difficult to believe that this is what he was talking about, a couple of paragraphs later, right there in the Gospels, his disciples come to him and ask him, what does this parable mean? And he says that the field is the earth and the people are the good seed, but that the adversary had come and planted bad seed. So he explains the parable as this is what he was talking about. It relates right back to the opening of the Bible, the first couple chapters of Genesis, and it carries on telling, about Abraham. They found the perfect specimen, and then they said, we're going to multiply your seed and give you an advantage of how to deceive your enemies, how to take control of their governments. So you can see that Jesus was someone who was on the side of humanity. He was one of the good guys. He was on our side. But they've done everything they can to either, ruin his name, like when he was alive, always accusing him of being an evil one and breaking the Old Testament laws and things. And of course, Jesus always refuted them so clearly that everyone could see that they were the ones who were in the wrong. But nevertheless, they didn't stop trying to ruin his reputation when he died. That effort continued on. But also, remember, Jesus said, heaven and earth might pass away, but my words will never pass away. In other words, once he spoke the truth and exposed the liars who were leading the organized religion, he said, once I've said that, nobody's going to stop what I've said from being heard. So the other tactic that they used, which he warned us they would, as Jesus said, as soon as I'm gone, they will come around preaching the same old stuff in my name. So it make me their new poster boy, but still be doing the same thing, which is using propaganda to take control of people's minds to basically enslave them to support the predator class. That's the game. And Jesus pointed it out in his time and showed that it was a genetic war on humankind by these extraterrestrials, trying to change the nature of our species to serve their purposes rather than leave us in our direct connection with our Creator to organically unfold our potentials and discover our uniqueness and take our place as equals with Jesus, which is what he said. He prayed for that. He said, I am one with the Father, with universal consciousness. This focal point of personal consciousness, am one with the universal consciousness. And I pray that you also will be one with the Father. I pray that you, personal focal point of consciousness, unique in all the universe, that you also become one with universal consciousness, the creator of all the focal points, the parent of all the focal points of universal consciousness. So, all of that was taken away, that exploration of our uniqueness and discovering of ourselves as children of God or as unique focal points of universal consciousness, equal with all other unique focal points of universal consciousness. Instead of naturally growing to that as so many other civilizations in the galaxy have done, we were interfered with. People came from outside of our world. You see how that is like a violent assault on us? An act of aggression? A breaking of cosmic law? And then took it upon themselves to change our genetics before we were even aware enough or mature enough to know what they were doing to us. us calling them gods, that was an attack. It's like infecting us with a virus. And this parable that Jesus told also explains to us, gives us the answer to that question that we've all asked. If there is a God, why does he allow so much suffering? Why does he allow it to go on for so long? In the parable, what Jesus is saying is that if we may not see why from our standpoint, but he's saying that what God knew was that if he intervened immediately and the way the parable tells it is allow his servants to pull up the weeds, to pull out the bad seed. God said, no, if you do that, it may damage the good seed. So the path of wisdom is not always very clear to the path of knowledge. The path of wisdom is taking more into account. Well, here we are, unique focal points of consciousness, children of God, just at the very beginning stages of coming into awareness. And God has been having children for billions of years. And knows, possibly from experience, probably, now that I think about it, probably from experience. He knows that it would do more damage to humanity for him to come in and eradicate the illegal and immoral genetic hybrids who were created to basically wipe out the native population of Earth and replace it. That if God were to just immediately go in there and eradicate them, that it would do more damage to humanity to handle it that way than if he would wait and allow both to grow up together, even though there's so much suffering involved. And then at harvest time, separate the good seed that had obviously lived a good life. That's what the good seed does. And then the bad seed that led a bad life. That would be the time when to separate them and basically free the indigenous people from the genetic hybrids, the domination of the genetic hybrids, to free them, that would be the best time and the best way to free humanity and heal the collective of humanity from this genetic attack by an extraterrestrial species.